Hello everyone, Alan Sens here, and welcome to this video on Cabinet and Foreign Policy. In this video, we're going to take a look at some of the basics of the role of Cabinet in Canada's decision-making system and a little bit on its role in foreign policy. We're not going to go into a lot of detail here, we're just going to get the basics. So let's get started. So by the time we're done, you should be familiar with the role of Cabinet in foreign policy decision-making. So what is Cabinet? Well, Cabinet is the supreme executive decision-making body in Canada. Cabinet is where the government's priorities are decided. Cabinet is where debate takes place within the government. Cabinet is where the collective position of the government on any given issue is developed and forged. And Cabinet is where advice is given to the Prime Minister by ministers in the government. Now, the Cabinet has evolved quite significantly over the years. This is a picture of Louis St. Laurent's cabinet in 1953. And compared to today, the group of individuals is quite small. Small enough, in fact, for them to fit into a single room comfortably. And second, you can probably see this is not exactly a hugely diverse group of individuals. There's a distinct demographic in the room that's rather obvious, and so a lot of that pattern has changed as well. So here, for example, is the government of Justin Trudeau, and you can see a much larger group, and that's to reflect the increased role of government compared to 1953. And of course, these individuals are far more diverse than the picture that we just saw. When we look then to Cabinet and foreign policy with respect to ministerial responsibilities, all ministers of the Crown have two fundamental responsibilities. They must carry out the responsibilities of their portfolio, first of all. So they have to manage their portfolio. And secondly, they have to support Cabinet. You can't just go into Cabinet and do and say whatever you want. You have to follow the priorities of government. You have to follow your mandate from the Prime Minister. And while there's room for disagreement, in cases of significant disagreement, of course, Cabinet looks like it's divided, and in some cases, certain ministers may feel they are forced to resign or may be asked to resign because they don't have the ability, in their view, of actually coming into line with the government's formal position. The power of the minister rests with their authority over their ministry, and of course the powers granted to that ministry under Canadian law. The constraint on ministers, of course, is their responsibility to Cabinet and the need to make collective, but critically, consensual decisions at the Cabinet level. Okay, now in practice, because Cabinet is so large, much of the work on the issues facing the government is done in committee. And so it's actually the Cabinet committee system that does much of the government's work. And this is where much of the planning and priorities of government actually takes place. Now, this particular list of Cabinet committees was characteristic of the Harper government. And you can see that priorities in planning, operations, Treasury Board, social affairs, economic prosperity, foreign affairs, and security, these were the main Cabinet committees. And obviously for us, it's the Foreign Affairs and Security Committee. That's the most important. But when governments come in, they can change these Cabinet committees. They can alter the structure. They can certainly change the names of the committees, even if they're broadly doing the same thing. So when we look to the Cabinet committees of the Trudeau government, we have a very different picture. And here is that picture. And you can see there is a significant difference. There's, first of all, more committees, and the breakdown of their responsibilities has changed somewhat. So we have agenda, results, and communications, which is basically priorities and planning. That's sort of the same mandate. a committee on open, transparent government and parliament. We have Treasury Board, that's always going to be there, right? That's the administrative and financial aspects of government operations. A cabinet committee on growing the middle class, diversity and inclusion. And then we have Canada in the world and public security. That's a committee that is of interest to us. Then we have Canada-United States relations, and this was the committee that was created in response to the challenges the government felt it was facing with respect to its relationship with the United States. And so that cabinet committee is an example of a committee created when the government feels it needs to coordinate itself more effectively, and when a certain subject matter is becoming so vital and so important that it merits additional discussion and additional support and resources. Add to that intelligence and emergency management, environment, climate change and energy, and defense procurement, and you actually have a fairly significant package of foreign affairs, security, and defense-related cabinet committees. And so for us, in this course, we're interested in all of those. Litigation management, it's kind of a funny one at the end, but this is really to manage issues of government with respect to litigation against the government, litigation on behalf of the government, and the Trudeau government believed that this was significant enough to warrant cabinet committee designation. I guess on one level you could say there's some humor here, because what are you going to be doing as a government? You feel you need to do litigation management, but to be honest, all governments have to do litigation management. So the Trudeau government is simply elevating this to the level of a cabinet committee. Okay, a little bit more on cabinet and foreign policy. Now, in theory, cabinet is responsible for foreign policy decision-making, right? It's the supreme executive decision-making body in Canada. And in the major decisions surrounding much of Canada's foreign policy history, that's been the case. Cabinet has made the decision. So, for example, entry into the Boer War, entry into World War I, entry into World War II, entry into the Korean War, all were deliberated and decided by cabinet. Recognition of the People's Republic of China. The nuclear warhead issue. This was an issue of U.S. nuclear warheads stationed on Canadian territory. And yes, U.S. nuclear warheads were stationed on Canadian territory during the Cold War. That was a decision made at the cabinet level. Free trade, the decision to embark on a free trade agreement with the United States. That was a decision made and deliberated in cabinet. On the other hand, however, in practice, a lot of policy initiatives are brought to cabinet by the committees or by some combination of the Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of National Defense, and the Minister of Public Safety. And, this exists for a variety of reasons. On the one hand, the government may feel that it is under pressure from external events, and the need to react to those events requires a lot of speed. And sometimes convening cabinet, because it's so large, can be quite slow. So a lot of reactive decision-making is done by a smaller group of individuals in cabinet. Also, a lot of foreign affairs-related topic matter is very technical in nature. Trade agreements, for example, financial rules and regulations, security issues, immigration, technicalities. So this requires a certain set of specialized advice and capacity and knowledge, which is really held by the ministers that are responsible for these areas. And so the full cabinet doesn't have that capacity or knowledge. Just a smaller group of ministers would have that capacity and knowledge. And then finally, much of what the government does is domestic, right? It's running the country and it's putting its own priorities and plans into place. And so much of the cabinet is devoted to domestic issues, not foreign affairs issues. So the result is that in practice, it's the committees that bring policy initiatives forward, or it's some combination of these four individuals who will really be the driving force behind Canadian foreign policy on these foreign policy related or security or defense related issues. Okay, so now you should be familiar with the role of cabinet in foreign policy decision making. So the last real piece here is just a reminder that we're not going into a huge amount of detail in this video, obviously, but I just wanted to give you the broad outlines, and we will pick up this material in more detail later. I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll see you again soon.